Politics will dominate the conversation over these next days, so let us begin with war fighting. War fighting in the Hindu Kush to the Atlantic Ocean. But this is war fighting at a particular time and place. You will all recall the bin Laden raid of 2011. And you will also recall, with the events around the SEAL Team 6 and the other revelations of how and when and why the U.S. located and solved and dispatched bin Laden, that there was another piece, actually 1.5 million other pieces. Those were the documents found in bin Laden's library. The last time we had a release of some of those documents, according to what I'm searching here, was the spring of 2015. Tom, Joscelyn, and Bill Roggio of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, as they keep the Long War Journal, are here to say that within these next hours, we're expecting another release from that overall 1.5 million. Tom, a very good evening to you. Please help me. The bin Laden library, what do we expect? What is still in there? And how will it help us? Good evening, Tom.
Good evening, John. Well, one of the things that Bill and I talk a lot about, including on your show, is that there's still a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of myths about what's going on in the world, and certainly the world of jihadism as we cover it, and Al-Qaeda, how it's structured, and these sorts of things. And we think the documents and files recovered in bin Laden's compound serve a purpose of informing the public better about how this thing was always structured. And it was never structured in a way that a lot of people say, which is it was sort of this cloistered small set of jihadists in South Asia who were just waiting to be droned to death. In fact, when you look at the files that have been released thus far, you can see that this was much more of an international organization, a networked organization, and that they had plans to survive the drone strikes and were actually doing a number of different things across the globe to further their cause. And all this is very poorly understood, we think, to this day. This long after 9/11, Al-Qaeda can't even be properly defined in our view. So with these documents coming in the coming hours, we hope to find new nuggets of details to report to people on it. But what's happened thus far is that basically a small fraction of the documents and files recovered in bin Laden's compound have been released to the public. Now, you'll remember that just a week after bin Laden was killed, all the way back in May 2011 now, one of President Obama's top national security advisors was on Meet the Press, Tom Donilon, and he actually said that the contents of bin Laden's cache, the library that they recovered, the Navy SEALs recovered in Abbottabad, Pakistan, would fill a small college library. Well, to this day, we only have maybe a shelf or two from that college library. We don't have the rest of it. And what's coming tomorrow, we understand, is there'll probably be dozens of more files released online. It's still very small compared to the overall cache that was recovered.
Bill, a very good evening to you. Why don't we have it all? What is the explanation? I can't recall the rationalization in 2011, but here we are in 2016. Is there something in there that would hurt us?
That's been the rationalization for holding the documents back, that it impacts not national security. But when you look at all the documents released, particularly with the second batch that was released after the first, there was nothing in there that would deal with operational issues. It was just basically history of Al-Qaeda, communications, how Al-Qaeda ran its business, things of that nature that had zero impact on how U.S. Special Operations Forces or CIA or intelligence monitoring or anything like that. These documents were not going to affect that. And I suspect probably, I'm just going to take a guess, 95% of what are in those files, maybe 99% of what are in those files are probably not going to impact ongoing operations against Al-Qaeda, particularly now since we're almost a half a decade beyond the bin Laden raid. So, not much of this information is really, affecting the daily operations of Al-Qaeda at this point in time.
Then, Tom, help us. What is the thinking about why the reluctance, why the slowness to get it out? Is there a compromise with diplomacy or with politics?
Well, I think the bureaucracy is slow to give up anything, really. If you think about, how long it takes to get stuff declassified that's decades old and totally irrelevant. One of the funny things I saw in recent years was that the invisible handwriting that was used during World War I or circa that era, and one of the predecessors to the U.S. intelligence community, was finally declassified and released, online. I mean, this is sort of how long it takes to get things out there. So we have an overclassification problem for sure. And for sure, exactly what Bill says, there are a lot of documents and files that could be released that have absolutely no real impact on current operations. It may be that some of them still do, in fact, because of the sensitivity of some of the reporting, but most of them probably do not, and especially given how old they are. So I don't think there really is a good explanation for this. I mean, we've basically, agitated for more transparency when it comes to the files recovered, whether it be during the Iraq War or in the bin Laden compound or elsewhere, mainly because we think it fills in a lot of what's missing in the public discourse and narrative on these things. And I expect we'll get a few nuggets tomorrow, but even then, it probably, the details will take some time to sink in.
Bill, on the bin Laden raid itself, these documents and their connection to the larger world, bin Laden was stuck in time in 2011. There was no Islamic State. There was no fall of the Mubarak regime. I believe he slapped at it back in 2011 before its fall. So therefore, it's archival only. Or is there a possibility we have something in here that will help us, that will make connections, some group of names, or perhaps revelations about the ISI or other intelligence operations goosing Al-Qaeda along?
Yeah, look, and that's so for instance, I believe there were several reports with the initial batch that there were going to be reports on relationship between Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and then all of a sudden those documents were pulled because the Obama administration at the time wanted to negotiate with the Taliban. Well, it's pretty difficult to negotiate with the Taliban when the details of the Taliban-Al-Qaeda relationship are being laid bare from the documents from Osama bin Laden. So I think you have a problem with that. As Tom said, overclassification, a massive problem in the government bureaucracy. The only, and I agree with you. I think some of the things that may be in there is maybe Al-Qaeda is talking about some key leaders that we may be currently targeting at this point in time. But I really can't imagine much. There's very much in there that can be relevant to the actual targeting of Al-Qaeda. Really, that's what the concerns would be. If there's any real concern, it would be either disclosing things that the U.S. government doesn't want disclosed, like i.e. the Taliban-Al-Qaeda relationship, and that's just flat out wrong because that has nothing to do with national security. Things like, Taliban or Al-Qaeda ISI relationships, Pakistani intelligence service relationships, at a time when the U.S. is, cozying up to Pakistan. They don't want information like that coming out because it just makes the U.S. Job of giving in to Pakistan's demands even harder. So I think that there might be a lot of embarrassing information,
right,
information they don't want out.
Tom, let me take a probe here. Iran and Saudi Arabia, those would be two dangerous actors if bin Laden in some way implicated that he was in conversation.
On the Iran relationship, there are clear indications of it in the files. Now, remember, this is a marriage sort of convenience, as some intelligence officials describe it. And I would say some of the files that have been released thus far show the marriage on the bad days. So, for example, when they're conflicting between the two and they're having problems and disagreements and that sort of thing, sometimes violent disagreements, as these jihadists happen to be. But there are good days, of course, and there are agreements formed between the two. And, of course, the State Department and Treasury Department, going back to July 2011 now, under President Obama, have repeatedly pointed out in a series of designations and other official filings that, in fact, there is an agreement between Al-Qaeda and the Iranian regime. To date, we haven't seen any of the files that actually deal with that agreement. We know that agreement existed under bin Laden's tenure. So it would be interesting to get those files. I doubt, of course, we'll get them tomorrow, though there may be some hints of it in the files.
Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Within the next hours, the bin Laden library updated. What's in there? What do we need to know? How will it help us? We'll come back with the war fighting in Afghanistan. And, of course, we're going to look very, very closely again at Guantanamo, always in the news. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor, Bill Roggio, and Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. They keep the Long War Journal here reporting on the scale of this war. And back to Afghanistan, something that is not solved and won't be immediately or in the distance. In fact, the 21st century will not solve this because the earlier 21 and 40 and 50 centuries did not solve Afghanistan. It's a rough part of the world. It has been shot through with grievances these last 15 years, and they're fresh and they're pressing. But right now, the Taliban is so aggressive that Bill has a story up that requires explanation, because it looks like the Afghan government has done something aggressive, unusual. It's not retreating, it's not apologizing, it's not rationalizing. Bill, in Helmand province, we've discussed this, how the Taliban are taking control of district after district in Helmand province. There's a Taliban prison, and you're reporting that the Afghan forces have raided the Taliban prison. Explain, please.
Yeah, so, on the face of it, you go, oh, great, Afghan security forces stepping it up, doing what they need to do. But when you really look at this, what you find out is that the Taliban is controlling prisons in several areas in central Helmand province. It's a key indicator that the Taliban are confident enough. Look, you don't operate a prison in an area that you think is contested or you think that the enemy is going to come in. The only reason the Afghans are able to do this is they use commandos and helicopters. It's not like the prison was raided on the ground. So these raids, there's been 3 prisons raided since the beginning of December of last year. So it's a key indicator that things are getting worse and not better. It's it's really a Band-Aid to conduct these raids. The only way to stop the Taliban from running prisons is to control the ground that the Taliban currently controls.
This is a challenge, Bill, because I'm going to try to stay away from farce. How is it that the Taliban condemns people? What do you do to be in a Taliban prison? Do you have to be wicked or good? Do they arrest people who've done favors for their neighbors? Why are you in a Taliban prison?
It could be for a variety of reasons, but typically what the Taliban claim, and there's a lot of reporting out there that actually verifies that they set up their Sharia or their Islamic courts, and if you're convicted of, various crimes, like, look, if you're doing something like against Islam, or if you're an enemy of the Taliban, typically you're just killed. So the guys that might be in prison, the people that may be in prison, they might be land disputes or petty crimes or things like that. So the Taliban typically they don't really hold prisoners for the guys that do things that really bother the Taliban. It's
just upside down, Bill. I mean, to an Abu Ghraib of the Taliban, you try to imagine who's in there and how they're doing time and how they talk to each other. It's very strange, but it does establish the fact that the Taliban sees itself as a government, not as a guerrilla force, correct?
And as they always have. I mean, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is what the Taliban calls itself, and that was the name of the Taliban state before the U.S. invasion in 2001. And the Taliban will tell you all the time that they have various commissions, that include, for the communications, and they have a military commission, and they have a refugee commission, and education, and transportation. So they run themselves as a government.
One more item. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, you report, has told the Congress that Pakistan is cooperative and engaged in the fight against terrorism. And Kerry's talent is that he says this with a straight face. I understand that. Is there evidence of any change in Pakistan's behavior whatsoever to give this rosy picture from the Secretary?
No, there isn't. This is the U.S. or the State Department wants to sell F-16s to the Taliban, right? Essentially, you would be to the Pakistani government. So you get Kerry testifying to the Senate and saying everything's great and the Pakistanis are allies. And kudos to Senator Corker for standing up to him and telling him that the Pakistanis have been quote unquote duplicitous. He used the term multiple times, and that is exactly the case. The Pakistani government goes after those who challenge the Pakistani government, and those are considered bad Taliban. And anyone who supports the Pakistani cause of destabilizing Afghanistan, fighting India, and be they jihadists or not, the Pakistanis will back them, and those are called good Taliban.
And so the Secretary of State did not comment when Senator Corker brought up the Haqqani network. He just didn't bother to explain the connection.
Well, what he actually claimed, it was actually funny, he claimed that the Haqqani network has been driven from some locations in Pakistan. I assume he meant North Waziristan, and that's just not the case. This is part of the duplicity. Before the Pakistani military launched an operation against the quote-unquote bad Taliban, and remember, that's not the Haqqani network. Those are ISI Pakistani assets. They basically gave enough notice to them. They just vacated the areas in North Waziristan before the military operation picked up to move to another tribal agency called Karam and went into the Pakistani cities where they wouldn't be subject to military operations, and just continue business as usual.
So the Secretary brought no new information. He was making assertions before Senator Corker, and Senator Corker made his own assertions. And
Senator Corker's assertions are backed by fact and reality.
Yes, it is the burden of history. Tom, who is Hamid Abdurrahman Ahmed?
Well, Ahmed was detained at Guantanamo from 2002 to 2004 and was subsequently transferred to Spanish custody. He was then convicted of terrorism-related charges, but the Spanish Supreme Court actually overturned the conviction, saying that he had spent time in the legal, quote-unquote, limbo that was Guantanamo, so therefore he was set free. And just recently, on February 23rd, he was arrested in North Africa by Spanish authorities in a joint operation with Moroccan authorities for allegedly recruiting on behalf of the Islamic State. Now, the press reporting says that he basically ran a recruiting network that recruited for both the Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria, and then later the Islamic State, or the so-called Caliphate. Basically, this is a guy who was loyal to Al-Qaeda, and his sort of loyalties transferred over time.
I want to be careful about this. The United States, when they release a Guantanamo detainee, do they stay cautious about his conduct? Do you have an exemption in the jihadist world when you've been a detainee released by the U.S. from Guantanamo? Are you seen as a source of power or money raising, or are you understood as charismatic?
Among the jihadis, it's certainly somewhat of a calling card to have been held at Guantanamo. It's something they can brandish as sort of an accomplishment almost to have gone to Guantanamo. And there's certainly so many myths about the detention facility there that they can live off of that. But at the end of the day, there are many other things that jihadis look for in their sort of leaders or people who are running the operations that are more important, including military knowledge and knowledge of Sharia law, that sort of thing. And this guy was known, according to Spanish authorities and according to leaked files from Guantanamo, as a guy who may have received some very sophisticated training or important training in pre-9/11 Afghanistan. Certainly Spanish authorities are citing that training to this day. So here we are sitting in early 2016, and they're saying that the training he received in Al-Qaeda's camps in July or August of 2001, probably August of 2001, was so important that it still plays a factor almost 15 years later, which I thought was interesting.
Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy with his colleague, Bill Roggio. They keep the Long War Journal. Within hours, the Bin Laden Library, another release. I'm John Batchelor.